the most interesting chapters in the entire series.
It's also our first taste of Westeros, right? Like we've never seen Westeros. No one knows what it is. This is how you intro a series. One of my favorite prologues of all time, really only rivaled by a few of the Malazan prologues, as well as obviously I love the Sphinx in the prologue of, I believe it's Feast.
Yeah, the second prologue too with Melisandre.
Oh
And
yeah,
then you go ice to fire. It's yeah, I agree. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, George has been a notable short story writer for a very long time prior to ever writing A Song of Ice and Fire. Did many short stories throughout the 70s and 80s. Even whenever he was a kid, he was writing shorter stories. He won multiple, I think, Nebulas and definitely Hugos for his short fiction. And a prologue, in many ways, can serve as a short story. And this is a great example of how fast George can get you hooked, kind of get in, get out. I mean, this is almost its own story from the get-go, right? We start middle scene, we end up getting into the climax with the duel with the others, and then the following action of the running away, which then actually serves as the beginning of the novel. You can also pull out all of these patterns in his other prologues as well. So this is a person who has been grinding for a long time in writing. And you can tell that whenever he solidified this prologue to be the first thing you ever experience in A Song of Ice and Fire, that he put a lot of thought into it. So much so that I'd like to point out something that happens within the first few lines of this prologue and ask
Yeah, go right ahead.
This, Matt. So we should start back. Garrett urged. The woods began to grow dark around them. The wildlings are dead. Do the dead frighten you? Sir Waymar Royce asked with just a hint of a smile. Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man past 50, and he had seen lordlings come and go. Dead is dead, he said, and we have no business with the dead. So what can we extrapolate from this? Because obviously we're looking at two different people from a different, like we have not met our POV yet, right? Which is Will. So what can we gather from the line? Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man past 50, and he had seen lordlings come and go. There's two things that I think we can pull from this that's very interesting. The first is that the POV that we're sitting in currently is young, because only young people think people in their 50s are old. Right? Like that's actually a really good it's a good giveaway, right? Of starting, he's actually starting to build the POV without us even knowing his name, without us knowing who he is, what he does. So this is your first bit of characterization for Will as a POV, but also Matt, and this is the one I actually attach to a little bit more. He was an old man past 50. 50 is not very old. So what does that tell us about this world? Life expectancy is very short. There are not a lot of people in their 90s or their 100s, right? And we'll see this as we get into the next POV, where we start talking about Eddard Stark, right? Bran starts looking at Eddard Stark, and he's almost considered like this grizzled old veteran, but he's really not that old at all comparatively. Now, the show aged everybody up. We know that, which honestly, not a bad idea, especially for the younger characters. But this kind of starts setting the tone that this is a dangerous world right out of the get-go, right? There's dead. What are wildlings? They're dead. We should head back. Where are we heading back to? And this guy's 50 and considered a grizzled old man. This world must be brutal.
Yeah, I agree. You know, it's also interesting to me too. You're talking about think about that. This is the first thing we see, because we know the next chapter is actually George's initial thoughts of how to create this series and what it should go, which is the Bran chapter, where his first thought of creating this entire series was a young boy watching his father behead someone. And that's where it went. And so why is he beheading somebody? Okay. And then you begin to piece all these things together. And it's because we know that one of these Night's Watch members leave and they run away. And I think it's such a powerful opening to the whole series. And I think the show, even though it kind of swapped the characters around a little bit in terms of who's leaving and what's going on, I think still did a very, very good job of showing the others and setting the tone for this. It's a horror opening. But it's still fantasy, and it's still very personal because it's just three people, right? You know, like a lot of books sometimes will just do massive lore dumps to start you off, to be like, this is the world, and they want you to put yourself in the mind. But here, George does it in a way of, no, I want you, just three people in the woods, you know, what's going on? One of them's in command. Who's the Night's Watch? And then you even get introduced a little bit to obviously the others, but you get introduced to some of these like nobles, right? Like, oh, Sir Waymar Royce. That's he's a noble person, but he's part of this group, the Night's Watch. And then they even talk about some other things too. Like this line here: Will had been a hunter before he joined the Night's Watch. Well, a poacher in truth. Mallister free riders had caught him red-handed in the Mallister's own woods, skinning one of the Mallister's own bucks. And it had been a choice of putting on the black or losing a hand. No one could move through the woods as silent as Will, and it had not taken the Black brothers long to discover his talent. So then you're even kind of thinking, okay, well, maybe these guys aren't so good, right? Is this like a prison sentence, right?
Yeah.
It's such a cool way to introduce people to the world, because he could have started with Daenerys,
Oh yeah, for sure.
a girl who has been who should be one of the rightful rulers of this whole kingdom, who's been exiled and is going to lead this path of dragons. And instead of starting with dragons, he starts with the cold.
He starts with
Right.
the cold and then gives allusions to the cold being almost burning later on, which is very thematically rich, because things not being as they appear or feeling different is definitely something that George goes into, but also sets up the social hierarchy, right, between Sir Raymar Royce, a grizzled old veteran that is not being listened to, by the way, ignoring good warnings from someone who knows what they're doing, the arrogance of the higher class. And then you have Will, who is very much like a normal common person for the most part, right, who just happened to make a bad mistake and is now here. And what do we see at the end is that we see this huge existential threat that is after Will, and he runs away from it. He runs away, which we actually, ironically, we see the others right here. We don't see him for a very long time.
Yeah.
And we will see people taking actions to not believe about the threat and to run away from the threat in many different ways, whether it be policies or the decisions they're making to support the Night's Watch. So it's actually something that happens again and again and again in a different way. So he's kind of showing you the attitude towards this existential threat from the get-go.
Yeah, and you see in this chapter too, they talk so much about winter is coming, starting with the Starks as well, which you would go into the brand chapter, and that's the house words, right? Well, first we get to see what winter is. And even in here, George does such a good job with so much foreshadowing. It was the cold, Garrett said with iron certainty. I saw men freeze last winter and one before. When I was half a boy, everybody talks about the snows 40 foot deep and how the ice wind comes howling of the north. But the real enemy is the cold. So, here he's talking about, well, it's just cold up here, the snow, the landscape, the, environment can get you. But it does begin to drive the narrative of the cold is the real enemy. And then he goes on to talk about it steals up on you quieter than will. And at first you shiver and your teeth chatter and you stomp your feet and dream of mulled wine and then nice hot fires. So here now you're also diving into the idea of Song of Ice and fire is good, and or ice is bad and fire is good. Kind of interesting too, because the ice and the others and the cold will actually sneak up on them here in just a little bit. And then, we even get our first naming of Maester Aemon here. Garrett glared at the lordling, the scars around his ear holes flushed red with anger where Maester Aemon had cut the ears away. We'll see how warm you can dress when the winter comes. The next thing you know, a shadow emerges from the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce, tall. It was a gaunt and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. Here it was white as new fallen snow, then there black as shadow, everywhere dappled with the deep gray green of the trees. The patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. Then a little bit further down, dance with me then, he says, which is so cool. He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps the cold. Yet in that moment, Will thought he was a boy no longer, but a man of the Night's Watch. The other halted. Will saw its eyes, blue, deeper than bluer than any human eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the longsword, trembling on high, watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat he dared to hope. And course,
And
we've done some Patreon deep dives into literally even this
this is the most important paragraph.
this segment, right? Because it's so interesting. One of, if not the biggest difference between the books and the show, outside of some of the characters that will appear later in the series, like a Lady Stoneheart or young Griff, is the difference of the White Walkers in the show versus the books. Because here, even in this chapter, something you and I have talked about many times is they seem sentient and intelligent and very different than what we're presented with in the show, which even the White Walkers themselves, right? Outside of the whites, which is the ice zombie things, these creatures, these others, these White Walkers might not have been created from the children of the forest in the books. The way the legends and the tales and everything go, it's possible they existed before and are their own creatures. So totally different. And they might be far more intelligent and things like that than we see in the show. So it's one of the coolest things here. Another thing that's so cool is I love that he establishes Waymar Royce as the guy to take him on, because now, even though you're part of this Night's Watch, if you're a first time reader, you're still got somebody who is a Sir Waymar Royce. It's not just a member of the Night's Watch, some random guy. It's a noble member of the Night's Watch, and let's dance. So you immediately establish, oh, this guy's probably pretty legit.
Oh yeah, for sure.
As a fighter. And he even, I mean, it's also one of just the coolest lines in the whole series. I mean, he stares down a White Walker, isn't scared, and is straight up like, all right, let's go. I mean, it's so cool.
That's that nobility, that arrogance that comes with the nobility, not realizing what he's facing down. And the other's reaction is actually the biggest piece of this, right? This is the biggest piece of the prologue, and the biggest piece of foreshadowing is they fixed, talking about the other's eyes, they fixed on the longsword trembling on high, watched the moonlight riding along the metal for a heartbeat he dared to hope. This is our nod that the others are far more intentional and intelligent than what we saw in the television show. They are checking the longsword before they engage him in combat. And then once the other checks out the sword, this is when all the rest of the walkers start coming out. The whites start coming out of the forest, right? What do you think they were checking for, man?
Yeah, could be maybe Valyrian steel, or
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Obsidian, Lightbringer,
could defeat them.
Who knows, right? That was Azor Ahai sword, these type of things. Like they were definitely looking at the sword intentionally. And for me, that is really cool foreshadowing for knowing that the others know of a force that the humans which can wield that would give them trouble. And maybe they wouldn't have engaged had a Valyrian steel sword had been raised. So that's really cool. And that's one sentence. That's one sentence that does all that foreshadowing.
And then it continues on just a little bit too, right? Where they talk about when the blades meet, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a high, thin sound at the edge of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Royce checked a second blow, a third, then fell back a step. Another flurry of blows, he fell back again. But behind him, to the right, to the left, all around him, the watchers stood patient, faceless, silent, the shifting patterns of their delicate armor making them all but invisible in the wood, yet they made no move to interfere. We still haven't gotten potentially a Night King like this in the books, but maybe this is the head of the others. None of the others, I mean, none of the other White Walkers, just to phrase it like that. But I guess you could also say none of the others do move in.
I'm not completely against the idea that this might be one of like the leaders of the others, right? Like the whole movement. But I've always been pretty suspect that there being a Night King in the books, as much as maybe it'll rely on the historical Night's King, possibly the Night's Queen, maybe. But it's hard to imagine that isn't a show interpretation of the prologue.
That they are going up against these White Walkers, immediately showcasing the threat. And then like they said, a few chapters later, we'll get to Tyrion, who's like, oh, Grumpkins and Snarks and Cersei, and they're up there, they're by the wall. And remember, at that point too, we've also come across not just wolves, but dire wolves that have somehow made in the next chapter. We've also come across these other magical beings or creatures that that exist. And there's
Well, it's
also
a
other
world that magic's coming back into, right? This
yeah,
is a world that's been devoid of magic for a very long time, and a lot of it's, gone down as myth or legend or folklore. And in the very first prologue, we see literally mythical beings creeping into the scene. And then on top of that, we see direwolves. And like you said, so magic is clearly the unlikely is becoming likely once again.
yeah.